Edward the Blue Engine is the best and most important character of Thomas and Friends. And this episode is about him. Edward the Blue Engine is the number 2 blue engine on the island of Sodor. He's one of the oldest engines on the Northwestern Railway and the oldest member of the main characters. Edward is very kind-hearted, mature, wise, and keen to help a friend in need. He lends a listening ear to others and gives sympathetic advice when needed. He is a very hard worker too, and always does his best to finish a job. Edward has also been the voice of reason to misguided engines and isn't afraid to call others out on their BS if necessary. Unfortunately, the big engines, especially Gordon, often see Edward as old-fashioned and slow. While it is true he is old and somewhat out of date, he has proved time and time again that he is more capable of working hard as any other engine. He stands no nonsense from anyone and continues to be as dedicated as he was the day he was built. So what makes Edward the best character of the Thomas franchise? Well, for starters, Edward was the first character created by Reverend Wilbert Awdry. That's right, not Thomas, it was Edward. Edward is a 440 K2 class locomotive, which worked on the Furness Railway. These engines were built in 1896, and the first Railway Series book, The Three Railway Engines, takes place in 1923. Edward would have been 27 years old around this time, which doesn't seem old by human standards, but when it comes to locomotives, it's a different story. Edward's class of engine was at the time the top-linked passenger engines on the line, which eventually became replaced by bigger, faster engines later on. And as tech continues to improve and new classes of engines continue to arrive and become the next big things on railway lines, Edward becomes more and more outdated. Age, of course, doesn't matter to Edward. After all, age is just a number. Edward is a very constant figure throughout the franchise. He isn't really a major player that often in the stories, except for when he is in those bad seasons we're not going to talk about. There's very few stories that are actually about him. His own book, Edward the Blue Engine, is about other characters with Edward as a constant figure. Cows is about Gordon and Henry, Saved from Scrap is about Trevor, Old Iron is about James. This is true for episodes in the TV series as well. Edward, Trevor, and the Really Useful Party is about Trevor. Edward the Really Useful Engine and Old Reliable Edward are mostly about Gordon. PA Problems is about Sir Topham Hatt. Hunt the Car is about Bill and Ben. This is also consistent in episodes that aren't even about him. In Escape, Edward called Douglas out after making a rude comment. In Mucking About, Thomas comes to Edward for advice on how to deal with Max and Monty. All in Vain is a James episode straight up, with Edward as a supporting member. I checked, and it seems like the only episodes from those later seasons that are actually focused on Edward are Edward's Brass Band and A Shed for Edward. Granted, those episodes aren't anything super special, but at least Edward himself is perfectly fine. Some people might say this makes Edward a bland, uninteresting character with no real defining traits of his own, and to that,
I disagree strongly!
Edward in his truest form is wise, aged, and experienced. So since it's in his nature to be the oldest member, he has very few stories, which is the point. Edward does have an arc throughout the series, which consistently touches on the fact that he's old and worn out. Every Edward-centric story is about him overcoming that false statement, such as when he saves Trevor from scrap, rescues a runaway James, putting Gordon in a position of guilt, etc. While Edward may not be the main focus all the time, it's actually a good thing because it represents who he's supposed to be. His role in the series is to guide the way for others. He is an aged sage after all. The other engines need someone to look to for advice. But if you ask me, the greatest and most defining story about Edward overcoming adversity is none other than, you all know what it's going to be, here it comes, Edward's Exploit. This is just a great episode, the only one that's truly phenomenal and actually devoted entirely to Edward. Though I think the way the situation was handled in the book version of the story is a little better. Granted, this is because of the model limitations when trying to translate the story to screen, but in the original story, the conflict was so much more dire. Edward's trying to get a train of enthusiasts home during a bad storm. Wind and rain is pelting down, trying to push Edward backwards, and all the while he's struggling to get this heavy passenger train through the storm. He pushes himself so hard that his crank pin snaps, sending his coupling rod flying and ripping his side apart. The crew takes off his side rods, rendering half his pulling power out of action. They try everything they can to get Edward moving again, dropping sand on the rails, making adjustments between the coaches, but no matter what they try, Edward can't get the train moving. It's here in this moment he's tasked with his biggest trial, to get a heavy packed train home with only one working axle, driving on wet rails in the middle of a hard storm. This is where Edward's character shines. He doesn't give up. He keeps pushing, and through gritted wheel slip, he gains just an inch of traction to get the train moving. Once it's moving, he's excited. His driver's shouting, the passengers are cheering. It's a truly triumphant moment where Edward perseveres through the storm and his passengers arrive safe and sound. And it's from this moment onwards that all the engines, including Gordon, finally 100% respect Edward. A true conclusion to his character arc.
The Fat Controller stepped angrily forward. He pointed to the clock. The excited passengers swept him aside. They cheered Edward, his driver and fireman to the echo, before rushing off to get in Henry's train.
Edward is Thomas and Friends' true best character because he represents determination. He'll wear himself to bits to save a friend in need. He'll push that heavy train up the hill even if he's the only one trying. He'll always be there to give his 2 cents on situations or give advice to the youngins, and he'll literally rip himself apart to ensure his passengers make it to their destinations safely. Despite all adversity, against all the odds, Edward never, ever gives up. No wonder he's so many people's favorite character.